All right, hello and welcome to Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice. Ian asks, if every state relies on a monopoly of force, then what distinguishes ordinary statehood from fascism in terms of its coercive structure? This is actually a fairly long question, and it's a very deep, well-asked question, so I will read it in full. He continues, Max Weber defined the state as a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. There might be a tautology in there somewhere. If they have a monopoly, then where else would the idea of legitimacy come from, right? If that's true, then aren't all states inherently coercive in ways that blur the line between ordinary statehood and fascism? Historically, the rule of law emerged as a way to replace the endless cycle of blood feuds with state arbitration as the ultimate enforcer of violence. I enjoy seeing this perspective out in the I don't know if he's read Descending Odin's Throne. I think he has. The mechanism that sustains rights and privileges is the same force, whether exercised by the state, tribe, or individuals. There's a question mark there, but yes, the enforcement of rights and privileges is part of the state monopoly. How is this different from someone like Nick Fuentes, who openly embraces state power? By contrast, those who appeal to inalienable rights, are they disagreeing with state power? Often overlook that rights cannot be protected or maintained without such force. We'll talk about those people a little bit. The disagreement seems to be simply arising from a misunderstanding of the role of force in sustaining rights. Well, I mean, I think the end part of the question there, Ian sort of answered himself. Yes, they are overlooking that. But let's start at the top here. It is worth, at least superficially, it's a good habit to get into, to question these definitions. I actually agree with Max Weber's definition, state as monopoly of force. It's just very descriptive. It's just such a useful, practical, and functional definition of what the state is. And in the absence of a monopoly, you have chaos. You have like Central Africa and parts of Mexico where it isn't clear which cartel has the monopoly, and so you get terrible violence. When one cartel, which is essentially a state within a state, has a monopoly on force in the area, then things tend to be pretty level, right? The state is the monopoly. It's a very useful definition. But again, it is good to get into the habit of saying, is that the real definition, and so forth. But the question, aren't all states inherently coercive? That is a libertarian argument, and it is worth asking, is violence as a backing identical to coercion? There is a sense in which that's true, but I mean, it's also worth asking, coercion on behalf of whom, right? Because suppose you and your friend wind up in a prisoner's dilemma situation, or you're going to wind up in a prisoner's dilemma situation. Suppose you agree in advance. You say, all right, we're not going to tattle on each other. We're gonna hold true, and we're gonna set something up so that if one of us tattles on the other, then the one who tattles will like get punished in some way. We'll lose a hand. We'll make it extreme. We'll make it medieval Islamic or something. And then they end up in the prisoner's dilemma situation. And one of them wants to tattle, but then they're thinking about losing their hand, and they're like, I don't know. That is coercion, right? But who is it that's coercing them? Well, in this hypothetical situation, they're coercing themselves, right? Now, when you are born into a state, you didn't write the laws. You have your Geworfenheit. You are flung into this state that we now occupy, and there are these laws that are coercing you, but they are also coercing other people to your benefit, right? If someone were to steal your things, or rape your girlfriend, or murder your family, or you, there's punishment waiting on your behalf. So it's not, while it is coercion, it's not coercion in the same sense of, an individual being coerced by another individual for monetary gain, or, something like that. Like blackmail, for example. Now, that's not to say that the state always uses its powers for good in that way. There are all sorts of things where the state coerces people out of, more tax money, or other things that are more for its benefit and not for your benefit. But the principle of benefiting the citizens is still there, and it's still very present. And the places where there is not a rule of law, where there is not a monopoly of force, you really feel that. It's not like the places in the world where there is an absent state. You look at, again, parts of like Central Africa, or the more contested cartel regions of Mexico and Latin America. They're not like, oh man, if only we had less government, things would be better. So that the coercion part's out of the way. Let's talk about fascism for a minute. So fascism, I like to start with George Orwell on this subject. George Orwell, in his excellent essay, Politics in the English Language, one of the concluding points, which is very relevant to this subject, and we'll come back to this later, the use of language in discussing politics. But George Orwell says the word fascism has now no meaning, except insofar as it signifies something not desirable. He's talking about the way that many words can be abused into basically meaninglessness. And that's essentially where fascism has arrived now. I believe George Orwell was writing that essay back in like the late 40s, early 50s. And it was already, he already felt like it was out of fashion. We are not out of fashion, out of meaning. We have taken where fascism as a word was in the 50s, and we have dialed that up to 11. And some of this has to do with, sort of communist theories of the dialectic of history, taking us either to communism or to fascism. So there's like an academic use here. It's not purely historic, but it is pretty ridiculous. And the fascism was a particular movement in Italy, right? In the 1930s. Now, it's not to say that there aren't other things that have sort of fascistic tendencies. I'm not trying to make some ridiculous sort of no true Scotsman standard for fascism here. But it is worth mentioning that the philosophy of fascism is not identical to authoritarianism, nor is it, let alone just identical with a strong state, as we've been talking about here, a state being the monopoly of force. It emerged at a particular time with a particular notion of what the state was in relation to the nation, in relation to the people, in other words. Most governments, including many of the more authoritarian ones, including many monarchies and many sort of socialist autocracies. That's probably not the right word. Socialist, sort of authoritarian states, we'll say, have a view that the nation precedes the state, that the state rises out of the nation and should represent the nation, even if it's doing so in a sort of strong-armed, like, manner, like Singapore or UAE, Saudi Arabia, something like that. That is not the case with fascism. Fascism and the fascists hold that the state gives rise to the nation, that the government is so universal and absolute that it is the government that gives character and eventually even genetic characteristics in a eugenic manner or in an incidental manner to the people. And it views the nation as sort of belonging to the state rather than the state belonging to the people. That is a huge, 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 huge difference. And this difference, this is an oversimplified version. There's a lot more to fascism. I'm by no means an expert in fascism, by the way, but that's like the big distinguishing feature. And it's an anthropological statement. It's an empirical claim. We can check. Is it true that states give rise to nations, or is it more true that nations give rise to states? I am of the opinion that fascism is not morally wrong. I don't have a moral bone to pick with fascism. I just think it's empirically wrong. I just think it's not historically accurate. And that's not to say that there isn't some sort of reciprocity. Yes, the state, laws do change people in some way, but you don't usually wind up with a state that lasts for any length of time if it doesn't represent the people or come out from the people in some way, shape, or form. And again, you can point to all kinds of exceptions throughout history. Those exceptions don't really prove a point. That they don't support the fascist doctrine of the state-nation relationship, unless I'm dramatically misunderstanding something. But this notion of the state preceding the nation and giving rise to the nation explains not just some features of fascism, but also sort of the tone of it. We have widespread authoritarian states around the world that arise from the nation. But the way in which the state extends itself is different if you view the state as preceding the nation. Obviously, the purpose of the state is very different, and the kind of accountability you get with the state to the people is obviously going to be very different, if it's present at all, relative to a state where it arises from or with the I don't like to use the word consent of the governed because that's just a cliche phrase, but with the blessing of the people, we'll say. So the point in making this delineation is that the force of the state is not unique to fascism, and it's not defining of fascism. It's not even necessarily a key feature of fascism. So when we talk about someone like Nick Fuentes, for example, what makes him fascistic, if he is fascistic? I've seen Nick Fuentes. I've seen some of his clips. I've seen some of his conversations. I obviously watched his interview recently. But if he is fascistic, it's not because he embraces or believes in, state authority. That's more or less universal. What would make him fascistic, again, if he is fascistic, would be what he thinks that state power should be used for. Is he trying to forge a new Soviet man? Does he believe that the sort of the state and the government of America, or of England, which preceded America or something, does he think that is sort of the heart of what America is, rather than the people? Those would be the kinds of questions I would ask to get to, even if Nick Fuentes is a fascist. I think he's probably not. I think he comes across as a white nationalist, which is kind of interesting given his own ethnicity. But that doesn't make him a fascist. And now, while we're on the subject of political theory here, it is worth mentioning the people who think that maybe we can have a society without a monopoly of force, without a state. We're talking the libertarians, we're talking the anarchists, we're talking some communists. Now, the problem with this idea, we can have rights without a state, we can have rights without monopoly of force, is that it requires unanimity in values and beliefs. And I can imagine libertarians saying, no, it doesn't. It doesn't require that at all. You just need everybody to respect the non-aggression principle. If only everyone would do this, we'd be fine. And that, of course, it just segues directly into questions like, well, what is aggression? What constitutes aggression? And also, what constitutes property? That's a big one, right? And these are not just vague conceptual questions. These are very, very practical things. If I'm, making a tremendous amount of noise at 2:00 in the morning next to my neighbor and preventing him from sleeping, is that aggression? That warrants self-defense? And, if you listen to someone like Stefan Molyneux or some of these other libertarians, specifically the anarcho-capitalist varieties, they'll say, oh, well, we can have private arbitration companies and things that do this. Well, that's still going to require a monopoly of force to arbitrate. Because if someone doesn't like a ruling and it matters enough to them, well, what if they just leave the jurisdiction of that, company, of that arbitration firm? You have to have a monopoly that's jurisdiction encompasses the entire nation or the entire state even for these firms. You could have an arbitration firm like that, so long as it is backed by a state, because otherwise people could just fight back against the firms. What you really end up with, what an actual society in the real world, where people aren't all unanimous in their values and beliefs about who owns what and who owes what to who, and what reasonable standards of living together entail, and so forth. What that looks like are blood feuds. That's the historical example, and it's also the contemporary example. I mentioned cartel violence, when there's an absence of an absolute monarchy of violence in a region. But we don't need to even go outside the country. We can look at our own history of street gangs and gang wars on the street. Those are also essentially blood feuds, basically. And those are symptoms of an absence of state monopoly of force in those areas. It is not exerting its monopoly over the expressions of force arising at the level of the street in those places. That's what that is. And I think libertarians bear some blame in this confusion that sort of brought this question about. This isn't statism fascism. Just the word statism is like a clue to someone's politics oftentimes. It's a confusion of means and ends, right? Vox Day, I like quoting Vox Day a lot. He has these just very quotable lines. In one of his books, I believe it was Cuckservative, he was dealing with the obnoxious argument that if you fight fire with fire, you become your enemy. It's like, well, first of all, he points out that the reason chemical weapons weren't used in World War II was because they were used back in World War I, right? It was reciprocity that eliminated the thing. So if you want to get rid of the thing, refusing to reciprocate isn't necessarily the path to get there. Sometimes reciprocity is. But second of all, and more to the point, if you're in a war and someone's shooting at you, shooting back at the person shooting at you does not make you just as bad as the enemy, right? Which side you're on matters in these things. And, in the same way, reciprocity it's not reciprocity. The use of force at the level of the state does not make you like every other state that has ever existed in all time, except at a very broad and useless categorical level. It depends on what you're enforcing. It depends on the society you're trying to create. Are you trying to create a Roman Republic? Are you trying to make a monarchy? Are you trying to replicate the Taliban? All of these different government styles have a different sort of ideal way of life they are trying to create and manage. And not all of those are equal. They have trade-offs involved. So the use of force by the state does not make you fascist. It doesn't even make you authoritarian necessarily. That's another question. But the fact that states and governments are sort of human universals, I think it, at least among civilized countries, it does two things. First, to go back to the libertarian point, it sort of puts the burden of proof on those who wish for a stateless or forceless society to show that this dream is even possible, which is a big talking point in libertarian circles. I am familiar, I know. I don't think they've shown that. But second of all, and more to the point of the question, it shows, because of the specificity of the word fascism as a descriptor of some governments, in the face of the ubiquity of governments that use force to enforce their rules, it shows that fascism is not a human universal and is not identical with just statism. Feudal kings and kingdoms were monarchies, but were not fascist. And like I mentioned before, many very authoritarian socialist countries in like Africa and Latin America are authoritarian, but they're not fascist. I actually blocked some kid, I think, on Instagram who was trying to tell me that Curtis Yarvin was a fascist because he was a bit of a monarchist. No. And maybe the big takeaway of all this is that perhaps we'd be best off by dropping the word fascism entirely from our political vernacular, at least for a few decades. We don't need to describe Nick Fuentes as fascist. We don't need to describe Curtis Yarvin as fascist. We don't need to describe Joe Biden as fascist. We don't need to describe Trump as fascist or Obama. It doesn't add anything. You could say, maybe, that Nick Fuentes is a bit of a would-be theocrat with his, and I understand that Christian nationalism isn't exactly theocracy. It's not ruled by the church per se. We have things like Christian theonomy from R.J. Rushdoony, and we have Catholic integralism, and we have all these other variations. But again, theocracy is not fascism necessarily. There are some similarities in the authoritarianism. There are some differences, though. Frankly, theocracy scares me a little bit less than fascism in theory. So I think I could do okay in a theocracy. I wouldn't be a first-class citizen because I'm not one of the believers, but I would know the rules. I would know where they came from. It makes sense in a way. Fascism is a little bit scarier. Practically speaking, theocracy is a little bit scarier because it's more likely. Fascism is not happening. It's not coming back. There's a lot of bad things about theocracy, but there's a lot of bad things about democracy too, by the way. And the correct question to ask in response to pointing out that there are problems with democracy would be, well, what do we mean by democracy? So I guess the point I was trying to get at in that what the best takeaway of this, I think, would be this whole discussion surrounding specifically the word fascism is the danger of labels. And I would propose to everybody listening to this a challenge. Just try this for 2 weeks. Try this just for 2 weeks, just to try it out for size. We'll call it the Socrates political challenge. And I'm using Socrates as my model because if you read Socrates' dialogues in the Republic, he illustrates all of the logical fallacies, but he never calls them by just the name. This is like one of the worst things to happen, I think, in philosophy was Reddit and all of these pages emerging, teaching people the names of logical fallacies. Oh, that's a red herring. Oh, that's a no true Scotsman, which I used earlier. Like, oh, that's an ad hominem. Oh, you learn all these labels, and they invariably get misapplied. And it turns people from thinking about concrete images and realities of things and saying, hey, the thing you were talking about here before, you're calling it by the same name, but I don't think it's the same thing that you're talking about now. I could call that equivocation, and the equivocation is the one that I'm most guilty of here. But these labels actually, I think, make people's thinking worse. And this is sort of goes back to Orwell's point at the very beginning here. Try for 2 weeks to describe things not by any labels, but according to how they appear in terms of concrete objects and images and relationships. So, for example, if someone's, and you can do this, but also you can translate what other people are saying. So if you hear someone say, we're facing a threat to our democracy, in your head you'd be like, okay, what are they? Don't just accept sentences with labels like that offhand. Say, what do they mean by that? Are they saying, I think we're looking at the undermining of people's ability to vote? That could be one translation. And then that might lead to a conversation about voting without this sacred term democracy. And instead of, saying, oh, that's fascism, or hearing someone else say that's fascism, you interpret that as like, okay, what they're saying is allowing the state to enforce the law would risk a massive growth in unchecked state power or something, and then we could have a conversation about how much power is necessary to enforce laws, or should we be enforcing laws at all? Some people say yes, other people maybe disagree, but avoiding those labels, even if only for a small period of time, periodically as a habit to phase through every once in a while, and then you can come back to using those labels with a little bit more precision, or maybe you come up with your own labels. You say, this label fascism is not right. But there's another label that serves it really well. This problem I'm identifying in, authoritarian right wing types. I'm gonna call it MAGA tards is too just lowbrow. I'm gonna call it like patriotic tribalism, or what you can come up with your own terms that are fresh and that Orwell associates with clearer, better quality thinking, because it's not these stale words that become habitual that just sort of fill in the blanks on their own. And there's very few words in politics that are a better example of that tendency than the word fascism. So try the Socrates politics challenge. It might seem like a very small step, but I think it's a small step closer to clearer thinking and better political dialogues and conversations in general. I hope you found this edifying. Enjoyed this. Thanks so much for listening, and take care.